Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May God's peace, mercy, and blessings be upon all of you. From wherever you are, thank you for joining us this evening to celebrate the life and legacy of our dear brother Malcolm X Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz. We have a wonderful line of speakers today who will share their perspectives about the life and legacy of Malcolm X. But before we do so, I would like to request Dr. Zahid Bukhari, who is the Executive Director for Islamic Circle of North America Council for Social Justice, who were gracious to organize this program today, to say a few words, and then we will proceed with the program, inshallah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much, Brother Shakil. So on behalf of ICNA Council for Social Justice, I would like to welcome all of you to this very important webinar celebrating the life and legacy of Malcolm X. Alhamdulillah, I think this year, Islamic Circle of North America Council for Social Justice and their its different chapters, they are organizing various webinars and programs on the history and on the personality and the contribution of Malcolm X. So that is, we definitely welcome all those activities on behalf of ICNA and ICNA's different entities, and especially Council for Social Justice. I just mentioned two developments, although these are the old developments, but still I think during this month they are happening again. That I think in the news media, again, that demand is coming that from Malcolm X family, they like to reopen that that investigation of his murder. And because there are doubts, what was the role of FBI and other government agencies, so they like to reopen the whole investigation with the light of new evidence which is coming up. And second thing, I think also related to not directly with Malcolm X, but also the overall issue of this Black History Month, that again in the congressional one subcommittee hearing, I think the issue of establishing a commission to study the issue of slavery and reparation to Afro-American community. That issue is again there was presented at House Resolution 40, and hearing was done. We fully endorse all those demands, and we like to work with all those concerned organizations and authorities to further demand these two issues: that the Malcolm X murder, the reopening of the investigation of his murder, and also establishing a commission to study that issue. But again, I welcome our guest, and I also welcome that the American Pakistani Public Affairs Committee, very active organizations based in New York, and now they are chapter different part of the country. They are very active, and on their president asked that they would like to co-sponsor this webinar, and the organization APPAC, the General Secretary is also here. She will also welcome, I think Brother Shakil will introduce her. So we also welcome American Pakistani Public Affairs Committee, mashallah. So they are co-sponsoring, and we hope that we will be together, we will be organizing several other program, event, and campaigns, inshallah. Thank you very much.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Bukhari, and my apologies, I didn't even introduce you, and I went ahead and invited you. For those of you who don't know Dr. Bukhari, he has been a leader in the Islamic movement in North America, and has been the former past president of Islamic Circle of North America. And then he also worked as director of American Muslim Studies program at the Georgetown University. Especially his work on maps, Muslim American Public Square, is of phenomenal importance for all of us. And Jazakallah khair, Dr. Bukhari, for hosting and organizing this program. And with that, I would like to also welcome Sister Aisha Yuki, who is an attorney by profession and a founding member of the American Muslim Professionals of Dallas and former chair of the Dallas Bar Association's International Law Section, and also served as the National Communications Director for Pakistanis for Biden. And now she's a board member of the American Pakistani Public Affairs Committee, who has co-sponsored this program. So Sister Aisha, take it away.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and may peace be upon you all. I am very grateful to the leadership of ICNA's Council on Social Justice and Dr. Zahid Bukhari to provide this opportunity and platform for a dialogue across sister communities. APPAC's primary focus is on building resources, creating policies, and fighting for legislation that is beneficial to not only the Pakistani American community, but to all communities. And in the spirit of national heroes like Malcolm X, we are striving to create a society that serves equality and justice for all. On this notable occasion, we look to a future where we support leadership and candidates who are clear in their commitment to full civic and human rights for all. We encourage and work simultaneously with other individuals and groups, such as ICNA's Council on Social Justice, who share our vision in the true American spirit of inclusiveness and equality. And our goal is to stand by those who take a stand against bigotry, against prejudice, against racism and hate. For far too long, the sister Muslim American communities have been sitting on the sidelines of the political process, thus creating a need for an infrastructure that promotes fair representation for all people. And we strongly believe that if it were not for the incredible and resilient legacy of our African American brothers and sisters who paved the path for Asian immigration as a direct result of their effort in the civil rights movements of the 1960s, many of us would not even have the opportunity to live out the American dream. We are also here to acknowledge the systemic racism prevalent in our justice system that has severely impacted the growth and development of our African American brothers and sisters. And finally, we are here to listen to today's inspiring panelists who will teach us how to be an ally in the same spirit of Malcolm X. There are many qualities of Malcolm X that are worth celebrating today, but the most important was his focused, root cause analysis of racism in our society and how he unapologetically denounced anti-Blackness. Despite the path that has been forged for us, bigotry and racism is unfortunately still an issue perpetuated in our sister communities. And it is time once and for all to come together to confront these biases that we hold in our hearts and embrace not only our fellow Muslims, but all humans as equals in humanity, just as our faith teaches us. So on behalf of APPAC, thank you for providing this opportunity to amplify the legacy of Malcolm X and to commemorate Black History Month together. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Sister Aisha. I appreciate your co-sponsorship and your words of support for this worthy undertaking that we all are collectively undertaking. With that, I would like to begin the program by the words of the divine from the first chapter, Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. Sirata allazina an'amta alayhim. Ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. We begin in the name of the most compassionate, the most merciful, owner, master, sustainer of the day of judgment. Him alone we worship, and God alone, him alone we ask for all help and assistance. And we ask that he guide us along the straight path, the path of those who are blessed, not the path of those who he is displeased with. And indeed, he has spoken the truth. Before I invite the first speaker, we have three eloquent speakers this evening: Imam Khalid Griggs and Sister Aisha al-Adawiya and our dear brother Bill Fletcher Jr. I'd like to open this evening first with a few words from the famous seminal work by Alex Haley about the life of our brother Malcolm X. And in the foreword, his daughter Ilyasa Shabazz writes this about Malcolm X, about whom we are going to talk about this evening. She writes, "A man who lived to serve initially a specific people, then a nation, and eventually all people of the world. Some have said that my father was ahead of his time, but the truth is he was on time, and perhaps we were late. I trust that through his words we may come to honor and respect all members of the human family as he did." And she closes the foreword with the following words from his father, and quote, "One day may we all meet together in the light of understanding." Those were the words of our brother Al-Haj Malik Shabazz, reflected by Sister Ilyasa in the book, The Autobiography, written by Alex Haley and Malcolm X. With that, it's my honor to introduce the first speaker, Imam Khalid Griggs, who is the Imam, the spiritual leader of the Community Mosque of Winston-Salem in North Carolina, and also serves as a chaplain for Muslim life at Wake Forest University. Imam Griggs is a founding member of Muslims for Social Justice in North Carolina and a member of Movement to End Racism and Islamophobia, and a board member of Interfaith Winston-Salem, and a trustee of Parliament of World Religions. Imam Khalid Griggs is a human rights and prison reform activist, and he lectures nationwide, and is a freelance writer, and he authored "Come, Let Us Change This World, A Brief History of the Islamic Party in North America." And he also has been the former editor for many years of ICNA's monthly magazine by the name Message. And it's a dear brother, a longtime friend. And Imam Griggs will speak about the role and religion of Malcolm X in public square. After all, Malcolm X wore his Muslim Islamic identity on his sleeve. Never was he apologetic about it. His transformation from Malcolm Little to Detroit Red to Big Red to Malcolm X to Al-Haj Malik Shabazz, this whole evolution of his life, and inshallah Imam Khalid Griggs will share his reflections about Malcolm X's role in the context of religion, and also our role, what can we learn from his legacy in our lives. Imam Khalid Griggs, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. Assalamu alaikum. I want to first thank the leaders, Dr. Zahid Bukhari and others, who allowed me to participate with our other two illustrious panelists. And I'm looking forward to listening to them, so I'm not going to take a lot of your time. But there are some points that I've been asked to make about the role of religion in the public square as it relates to Al-Haj Malik al-Shabazz, Malcolm X. But I would be remiss if I didn't first point out that on this day, February the 21st, in 1965, at approximately 3:10 in the p.m., Malcolm was martyred. He was executed in the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, New York. And in light of this, I'll ask that we just pause just for 1 minute and make dua, make supplication, or just whatever it is that you feel moved to do. But just for 1 minute, let's have complete silence in memory and the martyrdom of our brother Malcolm. Thank you. I just want to point out too that in the time that we paused, that it was less time than that, less than 1 minute, that our dear beloved Malcolm was executed publicly in broad daylight and in front of an audience of over 400 people. And I think that this is instructive for us to appreciate and understand some of the dynamics that went into this particular public execution of our martyred brother Malcolm. But I want to start out by talking about the public square, because it's not a terminology that's frequently used today. I mean, it's used. Dr. Bukhari directed a program at Georgetown University talking about the public square. So it is a term that is used, but I want to just give some definition, some kind of context to it. And the public square is generally associated with any place where Americans come together as a people and establish common goals in pursuit of a common good, achieving as a community what we could never achieve as private individuals. And so the concept of a public square is this space where we as Americans in the American context come together to dialogue, to discuss, to try to lift up our community in the ways that we can best do it. And so historically, it goes back in ancient times. The Greeks had their public square. They had their version of a public square where everyone would come together and debate and argue and try to uplift the community with their ideas and propose actions. During colonial America, we have a very similar concept of a public square, of people meeting out in the open to just discuss the issues and affairs that are most relevant to their betterment in any particular community. When we talk about our dear brother Malcolm X and his use of the public square, we are first introduced to Malcolm in the public square, on the public square of 125th and Lenox Avenue in Harlem. This was the public square that Malcolm and other African Americans who were trying to provide instruction and guidance to motivate African Americans to come together, to understand certain social dynamics about the white supremacist system that was so victimizing them in this country. And Malcolm found this corner of 125th and Lenox Avenue as a place where folks would stand up on soapboxes and other things to just address anyone walking down the street and to gather crowds to respond to questions. And this was a form of a public square, not a government structured public square, but it was a community-based public square. I can remember growing up in the 6th and 7th and 8th grade up to maybe, well, through high school. I used to go down to this corner and I would listen to the speakers. And because my cousins, who were just basically my age, had no political consciousness for the most part or awareness whatsoever, I don't know whether or not I ever heard Malcolm speak directly or not. I heard a lot of dynamic speakers, but they were never defined to me as to who they were. So this was a Malcolm's public square. This was his introduction out in the community to try to educate and discuss and answer questions and challenge members, people who were listening to him, to take their own situation, their own condition, and try to plan methodologies and be aware of what's causing this condition and what you can do to get out of it. When we look at this and the role of religion itself, not specific at this example to Malcolm, but we see that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, during his time, at the time of the revelation of the Quran, that in Meccan society, there was a public square there. It was called the Hill or the Mount of Safa. And that whenever there was a very important issue, that everyone in the community needed to be a part of the discussion, people would climb to the top of this hill of Mount Safa and call out the various tribes by their names to come and listen to them. And such is the case when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was given the instruction to call out to the people, to take your message of submission to Allah and accepting you as a prophet, do this in a public manner. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, chose the public square of that time, which would garner the most attention, which was this hill of Safa. When we look at the concept of public square and the role of religion in the public square, we have to begin to challenge ourselves as to how forthright, how prepared, how willing are we to enter our faith, to put our faith in the public square for discussion, even for criticism. If we just take one moment to pause and just think about how Islam over the last 20, 30 years, 20 years in particular, how Islam has been so vilified in public forums, whether we're talking about congressional hearings, whether we're talking about in auditoriums, wherever there has been a stage for Islamophobic individuals, hateful people, to dissuade others about this faith, they have taken advantage of it. And so it makes no sense for us to be timid about sharing the dictums of our faith, about sharing the responsibilities that we have as Muslims and how this will elevate the community overall. This was something that Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, that Malcolm X, and I'll say start at a period particularly after leaving the Nation of Islam, that his primary forum was what we could loosely interpret as being a public square. Now, not necessarily on the street corners, but he was, I think it was during 1964, and it was polar opposites. But Barry Goldwater and Malcolm X were the most sought after speakers on the college campuses in the year of 1964. So his public square became college, university auditoriums. It became standing out on the campuses and talking to groups of students. His public square had now evolved from the corners into some of the most prestigious lecture halls in the entire world, including here in the United States. And so Malcolm was not timid about expressing the necessity of us, those of us of Muslims, those of us who are Muslims. He was not timid about expressing what Islam can do for American society, and even the responsibility that we have as Muslims to take this faith out of our places of worship and to share this, not necessarily going out just preaching to people about the tenets of Islam, talking about the rituals of Islam or the belief system of Islam, but sharing in the public square how Islam and how Muslims are divinely mandated to take on certain responsibilities about uplifting the community, no matter what that community may be, whether it's the African American community, whether it's Native American community, if it's Appalachian whites, whoever is oppressed, that is the responsibility and the Muslims of the Muslims to take this to the public square. And that can be interpreted as taking aspects and our faith into the public square. One of the things that Malcolm is recorded as having said within the last 11 months of his life. And I just want to pause here just for a second. Now think about this. Here is an individual whose public life was perhaps not even 13 years, 12 years as the national spokesperson for Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, their national minister, and 11 months after leaving the Nation of Islam and embracing Islam in the way that 1.7 billion Muslims today embrace and practice this way of life. Just less than 13 years, Allah elevated his prestige. He elevated his how people viewed him. That Allah, in that short period of time, allowed and commanded for this individual to garner the attention of the entire nation and the world, coming from the humble beginnings that he had come from. You know, there is a narration attributed to the Prophet of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, the son of Abdullah, peace be upon him, that talks about how when Allah loves someone on earth, Allah will announce to his heavenly host, that he will announce to them that I love this person. And then Jibril and other angels will go to the angels and announce, Allah loves that person, so you love him. And then the command would come down to earth, and Allah would put the love of that person that he loves in their heart. And I submit that Allah, and Allah knows best, put the love of our brother Malcolm into the hearts of the people in this plane, and it had a lot to do, his discharging the responsibility of taking this message of submission and how Islam addressed the issues of oppression and the role that Muslims are to play in fighting and warding against oppression. I want to read just a very short thing here that after Malcolm had performed the Hajj in April of 1964, one of his stops was in Cairo, in Egypt. And at this particular stop, he was meeting with the rector of Azhar and so many of the scholars and just students there at Azhar. He had a very trip filled with interaction with Muslims and scholars and just the common people. And one of the things that he said in talking to an audience in Cairo, he was never shy about speaking his mind. And he was saying to them that we have to make the Quran a living reality. We can't just have it exist as rhetoric. We talk about Islam is against oppression, that Islam doesn't have racism. We have to make that a reality. And he went on to say that the Quran compels the Muslim world to take a stand on the side of those whose human rights are being violated, no matter what the religious persuasion of the victims. Islam is a religion which concerns itself with the human rights of all mankind, despite race, color, or creed. It recognizes everyone as part of the human family. And then finally, with this particular quote, that he felt that Malcolm was quoted as saying that he was duty bound to fight for the spread of Islam until all of the world bows to Allah. I can never overlook the miserable plight of people in America. And as was mentioned in the introduction, that Malcolm evolved from just being concerned about people of African descent to being concerned about all of humanity. And how this played out, how we know from his own words, is what he said in the public square, which was a way of bringing religion, in his case, specifically the religion of Islam, into the public discourse, into areas where people were gathering to try to understand challenges, but also to come together and to collectively have solutions for the problems that we are facing. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam rahmatullah. Jazakumullah khairan, Imam Khalid. Such beautiful thoughts and wisdom in this, and I really appreciated the idea of connecting Mount of Safa to Malcolm X Boulevard, aka Lenox Avenue in Harlem, and the call for action for all of us. With that, we go to our dear sister Aisha al-Adawiya, and I'll briefly read her introduction and then invite her. Sister Aisha al-Adawiya is the founding president of Women in Islam, an organization of Muslim women which focuses on human rights and social justice. She's a frequent speaker on issues of Islam, gender equity, conflict resolution, cross-cultural understanding, and she also represents Muslim women in the forums of United Nations. She also coordinates Islamic input for the preservation of the Black Religious Heritage Documentation Project of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. She serves several boards, and including the Malcolm X and the Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial Educational and Cultural Center and the Malcolm X Museum. Sister Aisha serves also as a consultant to several organizations and documentary projects on the Muslim American experience. And she's a guest host and producer of the show Tahrir on WBAI, which is a Pacifica Radio affiliate in the city of New York. Sister Aisha will speak on the topic of Malcolm X and his spirit of working together for the common and the greater good. I was looking at the new book on Malcolm X, The Dead Are Arising, The Life of Malcolm X by Les Payne and his daughter Tamara Payne, wherein somewhere in the later pages, they talk about Malcolm X running into John Lewis in Ghana, and John Lewis writes to this effect, and I quote, he talked about the need to shift our focus both among one another and between us and the white community from race to class. And then John Lewis goes on to say, my apologies, I think by mistake I had my video off. John Lewis goes on to say that Malcolm seemed very hopeful. He was overwhelmingly positive in his reception in Africa by Blacks, whites, Asians, and Arabs alike, who had pushed him toward believing that people could come together and work together for the common and the greater good. So Sister Aisha, please, would love to hear your reflections on the legacy of our brother Malcolm X in the context of working together for the greater good.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Thank you for inviting me to another conversation about one of my favorite people, Haj Malik Shabazz. I'd like to say that I'm struggling to find a way to say what I need to say, that it will be received in such a way that it can provide a way for us to stand with Malcolm, Haj Malik Shabazz, and embrace the principles that he embraced and carried to his death. So in this climate, February 21st, 2021, we find ourselves competing. There are so many programs today commemorating Hajj Malik Shabazz that it's difficult to find a space, a time slot to do these kinds of programs. And I can't help but think of the time that's really not too long ago, um, where there was a handful of people who were doing the work of trying to uh, um, embrace and uphold the legacy of Hajj Malik Shabazz. So it's wonderful to see these programs happening. So I just want to sound a few um, notes of concern that I have, so that as we do our work moving forward, we don't fall into the trap of tokenizing this man and his legacy. We know, I've just gotten off another Zoom conference, and we know that many of the things that we're being given now or told now, those of us who have been paying attention over the years, we know much of these things that are unfolding. And we also know that on holidays and such special occasions, people will come out, you know, and share their perspectives and their admiration for this kind of leader. But we also know that after the day, we go back to our silos and we're not heard from again until the next year or the time for celebration. So I'm hoping that we are in a place now, mature enough to not allow that to happen to us again. Haj Malik Shabaz's legacy is so profound that it would be a travesty if we just do tokenism and patronize this great man's name and his work and his death for one day, right? I think it calls us to really be open and honest about our actions in his name, and that we really are prepared and willing to take the necessary steps to be authentic, to be ethical about how we claim this legacy and strive to move forward especially at this time, because we're definitely in crisis. But for many communities, life has been a crisis. So Malcolm has been that beacon that sustained us through the decades. So there are some of us who fight to make sure that we don't tokenize his legacy, that we don't um, I don't know what word to use that would be kind, but we know from all of his speeches in his own words that he talked about his willingness and his call to all of us to work together. In some of the famous speeches that he made, he talked about not caring about people's color, but that he was more interested in the work that they were willing to put in to change the miserable conditions that we were living in. And that's not an easy walk to walk. And although we are all engaged in the political process, and other organizations that profess, you know, to have our interest at heart, but we also know that the apparatus of co-option is very strong, and we have to guard against that. And also at this critical time, we don't want to just speak platitudes about Haj Malik Shabazz. We know that this man was martyred for a reason, for standing boldly in the face of tyranny, and really speaking truth to power, with the understanding that there would be consequences for that. Yet he took those positions. And we have to ask ourselves, are we willing to take those steps and those positions that Hajj Malik took? Not just stand on ceremony on holidays, huh? But that we are willing to stand with people, political prisoners, people who are murdered by police enforcement or other agencies, all of the atrocities that impact people who have no power other than people power. Yeah. So, I mean, are we willing to stand with those people? Because that's what Hajj Malik did. Imam Khalid is talking about the public square that is now Malcolm X Boulevard. That's what he did, and that's the walk that he walked. So when we speak about this man, we have to be clear, first of all, what we are talking about. And I tell you, there are still many people out here who will rise up against attempts um, to whitewash his message, his legacy, because it's been too much of a price to pay to have that just become a postal stamp, if you will, or a ceremony once or twice a year. We need serious leadership to lead us forward out of this incredible circumstance that we find ourselves. And we really don't have time. We really don't have time. I'm sorry, I'm getting all kinds of messages on my screen. We don't have time to tarry. So the we have these messages from Malcolm telling, saying, make it plain, speak plainly so that the people can hear and understand. And that's what we need to do. We don't need any fancy footwork or anything like that, right? But we need to look at the oppression, not only in our immediate surroundings, but around the world, if you will. Yeah. And see how can we bring some remedy to the issues at hand. It's our responsibility. And if we're going to claim this mantle from Hajj Malik Shabazz, we can do no less. Our children deserve no less, and their children and their children's children. So the walk is steep. It's not a cakewalk. It's not going to get a lot of perks that many of us would like to have. There is a huge sacrifice to be made, but we have to be honest and say that we are willing to make those sacrifices. And on the other side of the sacrifices, it's an incredible freedom to know that you are standing on the side of justice, yeah, and that you are standing in integrity, solid ground. That's what Malcolm did. So that's our charge. And yes, we can celebrate and do all of these things, but at the end of the day, the work is hard, but it's so worth it every step of the way. And we also have to remember that if we say we love Hajj Malik Shabazz, he had a family also, right? So we have to be willing to inquire about those families, not just to stand on a stadium and, say, platitudes, but are we willing to be there for his family? If we love him, we have to love his family wherever they are. And as someone who's tried to do that most of my adult life, we cannot accept anything less than that. So that's my call, and I know that there are a lot of young people out here who are savvy, who are in positions of what they perceive as power, to carry Islamic principles and values with you into these halls of power or so-called power. But when you walk there, to make sure that you come strong in your resolve to make a difference, because you will not be able to walk quietly through the corridors without announcing yourself, or you will. So the challenge becomes, will you just sail through the doors? Will you really come with an impact to be made, with the understanding there are consequences and there are costs for that? But again, it's so worth it. And inshallah, Imam Khalid talked about sharing this message. This message is not just for Muslims. This is for humanity, right? And so many of us, we come from many communities, to build that bridge of understanding. And this concept of ummah, it's global, starting at home and then branching out to the rest of the world. So that's our charge. And again, I hope that I don't sound too harsh, but I've seen, over time, how we tokenize our people who sacrificed so much for us, even their lives. So it's no longer tenable. And I pray and I hope that we will be honest enough, we will be brave enough to make a difference. And I think it starts with knowing our history, right? You have to invest some time in knowing the history. We also have to invest some time in knowing, what does our faith teach us to do? What are we called to do? And in that process, we are never isolated or in silos. We always reach out to other communities, and join hands and forces with those people who are standing for justice. And then we can truly say that we're standing on the shoulders of giants. And may Allah bless us for each step that we take in this direction, inshallah. Thank you so much.
Thank
Assalamu
you,
alaikum.
Sister Aisha. As always, your words of wisdom stirs us inside, and you're so true that it would be a great injustice if we commemorate and celebrate the life and legacy of our dear brother Al-Haj Malik Shabazz in a ceremonial and ritual fashion, and not actually strive to live his legacy every day in our lives. And I have some questions to some of the comments you made. And inshallah, if you have time after, Brother Bill would love to explore that further with you.
Inshallah.
Our last speaker is my dear brother, Bill Fletcher Jr., who has been a lifelong activist organizing communities and organized labor, in addition to working with several electoral campaigns as well. Brother Bill has been the former president of Trans-Africa Youth Forum, and he is a senior scholar with the Institute for Policy Studies based out of Washington, D.C., and he's an editorial board member of blackcommentator.com, and he serves in the leadership position of several other projects as well. Bill has authored They Are Bankrupting Us and 20 Other Myths About Unions, and co-authored 2 other books, The Indispensable Ally, Black Workers and the Formation of Congress of Industrial Organizations, and Solidarity Divided, The Crisis in Organized and Labor and a New Path Toward Justice. As a good friend of Manning Marable, Bill has reviewed the manuscript of his book on Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention, which I would strongly urge, if you have not had the opportunity to read, we should. And Brother Bill also is a syndicated columnist and a regular media commentator on television, radio, and web. And Brother Bill will speak on the topic of Malcolm X and Black internationalism. Brother Bill, take it away.
Thank you, Brother Shakil Saeed. And my thanks, assalamu alaikum, first of all.
Alaikum assalam.
And my thanks to the ICNA Council for Social Justice for inviting me. I've been looking forward to this opportunity. It's an honor and a pleasure. I want to start by saying that Malcolm X changed my life, and I never met him. At the age of 13, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. My parents had a copy of it, and I just, for one reason or another, picked it up. And I had been paying attention to world affairs, but I picked this up and I could not stop reading it. And when I completed it, I knew what I wanted to do with my life. And that may sound strange at the age of 13, you know, but I decided, no, my life is going to be devoted to social justice. It's going to be involving a radical critique of the system we live under. It's going to be focused primarily, though not exclusively, on Black people. And I gained from the book insight, a sense of courage, a sense of someone who did not fear asking questions. I wanted to start there because this is very personal. And I tell people all the time, this is what triggered me. This helps to explain who I am and what I decided to do. And so I wanted to start there. And then I wanted to talk about this issue that Brother Saeed mentioned about Black internationalism. What is that concept? The concept is, in essence, this, that there is an historic trend within Black America that you can, in one sense, you could date it to the moment that we were forced to come here. But as a conscious political trend, you could certainly date it from the 1830s, 1840s. And it's a trend that positioned the fight for Black freedom in an international context and saw the need for those of us of African descent to not simply be fighting battles here in the United States, and not even just fighting battles for other people of African descent, but to have an internationalist view in the fight for justice. And in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, there was something in the United States called the Negro Convention movement, which were these regular conferences that were held by free African Americans. And what was interesting for me to discover was that at these conventions, in addition to obviously condemning slavery and making plans to fight that, they also took on other issues. One of the most important being Ireland and Ireland's oppression by the British. And there was no African population in Ireland. But the point was that the architects of the Negro Convention movement understood that it was incumbent upon us to be fighting against any and all forms of oppression, and that the oppression that the Irish were facing was actually quite linked to the oppression that we face in the United States. If I had time, I would go into more depth on it. But Black internationalism has remained a current within the US African American population ever since. And you see at different points an emergence of it, very conscious. Marcus Garvey, in addition to his Pan-Africanism, spoke out in favor of the October Revolution in Russia and spoke out against the oppression of the Irish. You had the well-known W.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, who went and entertained troops in Spain fighting fascism in the 1930s. The list could go on and on. There's this current that exists within and among our people that is summarized by this notion of Black internationalism. And Malcolm X falls right in this line. That Malcolm, when you understand the forces that influences internationalism, many people think, well, they assume it was just in the Nation of Islam. No, Paul Robeson, who Malcolm studied in terms of his speech style, his style of oratory, he also studied Paul Robeson's views on the world. So Malcolm was like a sponge, and he took ideas from different places and was constantly learning. Malcolm's internationalism evolved over time. It was at one point a sort of strange combination of Black nationalism and internationalism that was represented by the Nation of Islam. But there was also this combination of what I think would be fair to call Islamic internationalism, Pan-Africanism, and Black internationalism. So the Black internationalism for Malcolm X was based on a search for the roots of our struggle, a search for models for liberation, and a fight for consistent justice. And this is one of the things that's fascinating about Malcolm and understanding Malcolm's significance, that he never lost sight of the necessity to fight for consistent justice, not just justice for US African Americans, not just justice for people of African descent, but the issue of consistency. And thereby, as you watch Malcolm grow, speaking out around issues of US foreign policy, speaking out against imperialism. Malcolm, therefore, situated the US African American struggle in the battle for human rights and self-determination, which was in fact a global fight. And he was not simply looking at civil rights, because for Malcolm and for many others in the 1960s, as important as the battle for civil rights was, the concern that he and others felt was that there was a tendency to look at the struggle of African Americans as a civil rights struggle as only being a struggle within the United States, as if to say that we could somehow resolve our situation in the United States without at the same time taking on the fight against imperialism, the fight against global white supremacy, the fight against global injustice. And so this was part of the challenge that he saw, a challenge in his fight for people of African descent, indeed for people who had a descendant, that were the descendants of folks throughout the global South. Therefore, for Malcolm, the struggle in Algeria or the Congo or Vietnam meant as much to him as struggles in Alabama, Connecticut, or Virginia. And you could hear this in his oratory, that there was a passion with which he spoke about global events. Particularly, I'm thinking about the Congo, what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which during his lifetime had been the Belgian Congo, and then ultimately the Democratic Republic of the Congo was being ripped apart by Europeans and the United States. And Malcolm was one of the major voices talking about why we as African Americans needed to be thinking about the fight for freedom in the Congo, why it should concern us, and not be something that we simply say, well, that involves someone else. Malcolm's views on Black internationalism evolved, and they evolved in a number of interesting ways. They evolved from a view that was initially one of defining the fight in racial terms through a US African American framework. But over time, when he talked about Black nationalism, he started to encounter, as in his own words, certain questions that he had difficulty answering within his prior framework. There's a very famous story about when he was in Africa and had the opportunity of a meeting with a North African revolutionary. He does not mention the person's name. And this revolutionary, who I believe was also a diplomat, may have been from Algeria, said to Malcolm, when you're talking about Black nationalism, where do I fit in? And so from that statement, one can assume a number of things. One is that this person may have been quite light-skinned. Another is that this person may have assumed that Black nationalism was focusing only on the struggle of African Americans. And what's interesting is that by Malcolm, in his own words, posing this and identifying that this was raising for him a question that he needed to think through, that pointed in the direction that the rest of us should be following, and many of us have tried. He posed the question, and he was signaling a new and broader trajectory for his interpretation of Black internationalism, a trajectory that was subsequently picked up by groups like the Black Panther Party, the Republic of New Africa, the Revolutionary Action Movement, and many others. Therefore, we should be proceeding along the lines of that trajectory, not stopping in February of 1965, not stopping in the late 60s or early 70s, but understanding that our fight is in fact a global fight, and that there will be no freedom here for us as people of African descent as long as global injustice prevails. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, my brother Bill. Well said. Undoubtedly, Brother Malcolm was just as concerned about the global South as you said. I have several questions in mind, and Brother Ramiz, if there are questions from the audience, if you would be so kind to plug it in the chat box. But in the meantime, if you allow me to, I will go in the reverse order, asking a question to Brother Bill, and then to Sister Aisha, and then to Brother Khalid. Since we have you, Brother Bill, I was reading this book by the new book, The Dead Are Arising, Life of Malcolm X by Les Payne and his daughter Tamara. In this, she writes something to this effect. I think this is also mentioned in the Manning Marable's book also, in the context of internationalism, right? So somewhere here she says, rather quoting Malcolm, "We in America are your long lost brother," and he's addressing to people in Africa when he was visiting there. "And I'm here to remind you that our problems are your problems." And then this is in the context of beseeching African leaders to seek UN investigation into the abuse of Afro-Americans, which did not happen. So I'm wondering if you would be so kind to share any thoughts and reflections on that. Why Malcolm wanted to drag, quote unquote, the abuses of the US imperial power of the African American brothers and sisters in US with the help of African leadership in the United Nations, and why that didn't happen. You're on mute.
I was mute, yes. Thank you very much. A few thoughts on this. One is that Malcolm's internationalism, this may sound like a tangent, but forgive me, demonstrates the weakness of the movement in the United States that's called the American Descendants of Slavery. That basically situates the problems of African Americans as being the problems and challenges of people who have a direct lineage to enslavement, pre-65, 1865. And what Malcolm was pointing out was that, no, you can't look at our situation like that. First of all, because Black America has evolved over time. The Cape Verdeans, the Caribbean migration, etc. And we've evolved over time. So that's one point in terms of understanding that as a people, we are in many ways quite global, even here in the United States. The second thing is that Malcolm was hoping that African countries, having lived under the heels of European colonialism, would understand our situation and would be prepared to speak up around white supremacy. And it was an understandable hope, but he misunderstood the political character of most of those regimes. That is that most of the regimes in Africa, post-colonial, had made peace with colonialism and with their colonial former occupiers, made peace with imperialism, and were very, very reluctant to upset the apple cart. But Malcolm wanted to embarrass the United States internationally. He wanted to, in the best sense of it, demonstrate the hypocrisy of the United States, where the United States felt free to make various proclamations about what was going on around the world, but at home was perpetuating Jim Crow segregation, which was essentially US apartheid. And so he wanted to demonstrate that, and that the United Nations, as had been recognized by William Patterson, by the way, in the 1950s, that the United Nations was a court of public opinion. And it was there that our case should be brought. And I think that this is something that also probably contributed to his death, that there were a number of forces, as Manning Marable identifies and others, that were very fearful of Malcolm internationalizing the African-American struggle. But that didn't stop Malcolm from going forward. So I think a number of these things came together, and there was a real reluctance. And I would argue to this day that there are too few African countries that are willing to speak up about the condition facing those of us in the United States. And this is shameful.
Thank you. And I would extend the list of countries in Africa to quote-unquote Muslim countries also, who most likely will run away in opposite direction of Malcolm X today as well.
Absolutely.
That takes me to this, Aisha. I mean, you had mentioned so eloquently about the idea of tokenism versus living the legacy of Malcolm X in our daily life, and not just for a day in a year, but rather every day. And that ring resonates with me so well. I'm wondering, and I hope that I'm not putting you in an awkward position, but
No.
being the respected auntie you are of all of us, and then we learn at your feet so much and for so long. If Malcolm X were to be alive today, what do you think the Muslim leadership in the United States will do? Will they embrace him and, love his message and run with it and say we are with you, or they'll run in opposite direction?
Primarily, I think it will run in the opposite direction. Yes, unfortunately, we can see. I mean, the statement that Brother Bill just laid out is still with us today. It's not an easy road to speak truth to power, let alone act, in that way. So, and you can see also that, take the previous administration, presidential administration, for instance, right? It was very clear to many people that we were being oppressed on so many levels. But now I think that we are going to be finding ourselves in a position where we feel that we are safe now, right? That, oh, well, now, things are getting back to normal. So you'll hear us say things like, this is not us, this is not our values, and this kind of rhetoric. But in fact, it is our values. And there is a groundswell of actions and supports that buoy the kind of outrageous behavior that we've seen over the past few years. So I think that most people, unfortunately, because we are striving to be close to what we perceive as power, that's our goal. We want to be on the winning team, as it were, right? So that's where we'll land. And so you'll have a few people hanging out in the outpost, the maroons, if you will, who will continue, to struggle to bring about this consciousness in enough people to move us forward. So I don't think that we can be optimistic in that regard. Uh, Malcolm talked about, when he talks about suffering peacefully. You go to the dentist and you get Novocaine, and you don't real. Well, I think that that's where we're headed now again. So I hope, inshallah, that we will have enough people to continue to encourage us not to fall asleep or drink the Kool-Aid, as it were, but to continue to study the history. And we must know the history in order to know where we're going. And so, I mean, there's a lot to be said here. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. You answered my question. Certainly, I have the same feeling, and that leads us to say that we have a lot of work to do to really relive and revive and restore the integrity and courage and compassion of Brother Malcolm in our community and society at large. Brother Khalid, you mentioned about sharing Islam, right? I think Malcolm, I remember, I don't remember the name, but when one of the members or community members, I think, were killed by the police, and he takes a group of people to the police station, then subsequently to the hospital, and stands firm and say, we want to make sure that this brother is taken care first, and then we will go, right? There is a segment within the community of proselytizing and preaching to others about Islam and so on. Malcolm lived through, not so much preached about, right? So can you talk a little bit more about what opportunities, what avenues that Muslims today can undertake in the US in sharing Islam without necessarily preaching and proselytizing?
That's a very good question, Brother Shaquille. And I just want to thank Brother Bill and Sister Aisha for their response. It's very, very much on point. I mean, not that you need me to say that's on point, but I really enjoyed your responses to your questions there. But, one of the realities that those of us who are African-American Muslims face today is that there seems to be almost a vanishing African-American community, not so much literally, but you can go to masjids and Islamic centers all across the country, and you stand and you start looking around. It's like, well, where are the African-American? And I submit that one of the reasons that we perhaps are not seeing as many shahadas, people embracing Islam from the African-American community today, and I think it's a major factor, is that during the period when we had a high number of African-Americans embracing Islam, Islam, for the most part, was being presented in a manner that it was relevant to the lives of the people in the community. And by that, I mean that we weren't just coming and preaching to the people and telling them about, it's almost, you're going to go to heaven if you do this. And, that's definitely the ultimate objective for religion anyway, Islam and every other religion, Abrahamic faith anyway. But what Malcolm demonstrated was a concern, a heartfelt concern to elevate the plight and the conditions of the oppressed in the African-American community and beyond. And I think too often, over the last few decades, we have kind of, as African-Americans I'm speaking, I think we have pulled back from our identity as being a part, that this is our tribe. And I may be a tribal member who's Muslim, but that's my mama, my daddy, my sister, my brother. I'm a part of that tribe. And whatever I need to do to try to ease the system, get the foot off the neck of my tribe was halal, was lawful, then this is what I'm going to do. And I think somewhere over the years, and Allah forgive me if I'm wrong, but it's just my assessment. I think somewhere along this path, up until this moment, there have been a number of things that have happened for us to pull back from the kind of forthright, straight talk. This is analysis of the situation, and then the capacity and the willingness to call out things as we see it. And give you an example. In the local community that I'm a part of, and I don't think it's unique to the city where I'm from, but there are a number of Muslims who sell alcohol and beer and pig feed and rolling paper up under the table, maybe crack from under the counter, and who are Muslim. And it's the neighborhood in the community talking to brothers on the street and just talking to that, and they're saying, look, man, you're talking to me, okay, but I get my rolling paper, I get my crack beer, my wine from your Muslim brother. And you're talking about Islam uplifts the community, but look at what you're doing, right? So I think that it creates an unnecessary barrier between the call of Islam to people in the African American community, when so many of our Muslim brothers, and so we got it on two fronts, and I'm gonna shut up. Got it on two fronts. We got many of our immigrant brothers who are selling this poison in the community, right? And it's help to destroy the community. And then you have the African Americans who we're not recognizing the necessity to say or do something about not just that situation, but the overall plight of Black folks in this country, whether they're Muslim or not. And so I think that this disconnect is there. It was something that Malcolm was very clear about. He wasn't going, whether he was talking to Said Ramadan, when Said Ramadan gave him those 9 questions on his last trip coming back to the States, and he stopped in Geneva, Switzerland, and he gave the head of the Geneva Islamic Center, gave him these 9 questions and said, Malcolm, you're a smart guy. You got a lot of intellect. You got a worldview perspective. How is it that you can still be talking about the problems of Black people? You're not just in that nation of Islam. And Malcolm, made it very clear that his salvation or his freedom from these immediate conditions, how people are treating him, that's no solution for the majority of the people in the African American community. And unless and until those conditions change, I'm going to continue to be on that. And that's what I think that me and others from the African American community, Sister Aisha has always been on that, right? That's where she's been. Brother Bill, that's where he's been. We have to get on that page. And I think that we'll see more people from the African American community, again, coming into Islam. I think that the respect of Muslims will be elevated in general.
Jazakallah khair. No, so true, so true. I mean, I as a student of Islam and as a student of Malcolm X's life, I see that, Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was not a member of, actually he was and then he came out from the quote unquote elite tribe, and he stood with poor and the oppressed his entire life. So that's a prophetic legacy that Malcolm inherited and practiced it so well and inspired us all in so many ways.
He was always with the oppressed.
Right, always with the poor and always with the oppressed, regardless of one's faith and religion and so on and so forth. With that, if any of you have any follow-up questions with your fellow panelists, please shoot. Otherwise, I have a closing question to all of you.
Yes, I do. There is a very important piece of work that we have. I think that we were afraid in many instances or whatever, but we dropped the ball or never took the ball and continue Malcolm's work to approach the United Nations. Now, I'm one who's of the opinion that there's so much corruption in so many of these institutions. So, what hope do we put in them to bring a remedy to the conditions? My question is directed to Brother Bill. So, what is the value or the efficacy of continuing that march to the United Nations to complete Malcolm's work?
I think it's a great question, Sister Aisha. I think that the importance is in terms of education and consciousness. That bringing our case before the UN potentially brings it to a global audience, and so part of this is then raising people's consciousness, but also part of it is about building the kind of alliances that Malcolm believed were important. Malcolm was relying, however, on governments. I think we have to think about alliances less with governments and more with popular movements. And so I think we've learned. I think that, we've had experience. We've seen what happens with neocolonialism. And so I think that it remains a value. Just as there's a value of going to the United Nations around the Palestinians or the Sahrawis, the people in the Western Sahara, it's important to bring these cases there, and because it is so easy for these various struggles to get marginalized or completely invisibilized. So that's why I think it remains relevant.
Can you think of any steps that we need to be at least considering now, some strategy around formulating a plan to do just that?
Yes. And that discussion would take us for another hour.
Okay.
but the short answer is that it necessitates a willingness for a very broad grouping of people who may not necessarily like each other to be prepared to sit down at the table and to talk about a plan. And so it can't be the exercise of one group or even a couple. It really needs to be something far broader than that. If you may, I wanted to also pose something that may be a bit provocative, and
Good.
So we don't really have the time. But I was thinking about, Imam, your response to the question. And when I became radicalized, Islam was a component of progressive radicalization. Yeah. Progressive.
Right.
I associated it with the Algerian Revolution, for example.
Yep.
And so when I looked at Malcolm, it was like Malcolm saw no sunshine, no daylight between his belief in Islam and his belief in revolutionary politics.
Yeah.
But something really bad has happened since. With all due respect, the rise of Wahhabism, the rise of Al-Qaeda, Daesh, has put a different. I would wager, forgive me, that has also had an impact on Islam and Black Americans, because if it weren't for Black Americans, there would be no Islam in the United States. It's our people, right, that embraced this early, right? But I think that there's a crisis, and perhaps at some later point we can actually have a more in-depth discussion about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I,
Brother Bill, Brother
yeah.
Shakil, can I make one quick
Okay.
comment?
Please
Please,
go
please,
ahead.
please.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love this
And,
conversation.
yeah, and direct response to what you're saying, Brother Bill. Let me share something with you, kind of personal anecdote here.
Mhm.
In 1976, I was invited to go. I was a member of Islamic Party in North America, and I was one of two people invited to go to a Zionism racism conference that was held in Tripoli, Libya,
Mhm.
in July of 1976. And we were given a driver and all this stuff. Said we can go anywhere we want to go in the country except for the military bases. So the first thing came out of my mouth is, I've been reading and hearing about all of these different liberation fronts that this government is supporting. I want to see it. And so when he took me, the driver took us into that area, and we were going down these little narrow, uh, uh, between buildings and nondescript buildings. And I mean, literally, I bet it was 15, 20 different liberation fronts from around the world
Yeah.
that were in a series of buildings with no names or numbers or anything on them. I thought I had died and gone to heaven. Stuff like political heaven.
Right.
I thought
Right.
I was in political heaven, because to me that was Islam.
Mhm.
It was about struggling on behalf of the people while serving our Creator, but it was no separation between the struggle that I had come from and my Islam. It was
Mhm.
just a continuation, and I just felt that it had given me the discipline and structure that I needed. And this is what I've seen that's been so absent. And you're right. I
Yeah.
mean, some of the worst currents that come through, and I'm gonna get my head beat up when I go, outside from some of our local Wahhabi brothers. But I mean, some of the worst currents that come through the Muslim community have been those, doctrinaire, extremist kinds of, and it turns a lot of people off. It
Yeah.
turns a lot of people off. So I agree with you. I think your analysis is spot on. It's something that has not contributed to that continuation of Islam as a vehicle for struggle
Mhm.
and fighting against the oppressors and this kind of thing. It puts us in almost doctrinal straight
Mhm.
jackets, where
Mhm.
we're so confined by, the length of my pants, or that we can't get to other issues.
Indeed.
Yeah. So
Can I
true.
just
So
jump
That's for
in
another
very, very,
discussion.
very quickly?
please,
Uh,
please, Fletcher.
yeah. I think that in this context, it's important to factor in other forces that feed this
Mhm.
insanity, right?
Mhm.
Because on the one hand, we are we are very aware. Well, we think that we are aware about programs that talk about radical extremism. Yeah,
Mhm.
but on the other hand, we think that we have a very just uh, uh, democratic process at home. So we don't see the undercurrents. You know, Bill, you talked about imperialism, right? And
Mhm.
how that really is the granddaddy. I would say the grandmother also, because it's not just men who are perpetuating these violent systems, of oppression and hegemony. So we have a lot of study and catch up to do. So I agree that we need another forum to
Mhm.
thrash some
Yes.
of this out. But yeah, I don't think that we're going to find very many people in the Muslim community, for instance, who even acknowledge anything about imperialism, U.S. imperialism, and that we're just fine with the system as it is. And therefore, when we enter the halls of power, we don't bring any critique. uh, we have something called the squad now, right?
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
think that it's our responsibility to support those people who are trying to make a difference.
Mhm.
I also believe that the system is designed to perpetuate itself. So to what extent are we willing and able to bring change, right? At the same time, we have to feed ourselves, our families, our communities. So the economic disparities also is another thing that at some point we will talk about. But maybe we need to have a strategy session to talk some of these things out so that we can get to a place to move forward, inshallah.
Sounds good.
So true, so true. And I think I would request on your behalf to Dr. Zahid Bukhari to give us another opportunity, maybe a couple of hours, to really look through and review these challenges that we all have been facing, particularly over the last 2 decades, and even more, to continue this conversation. But Zahid, you're okay to do another session on these conversations?
I think I will do it. And these things not radical. We have to do it.
Exactly. Thank you so much.
One suggestion: let's do it after Black History Month.
Yeah,
That's right. Yeah.
I don't know how much more I can handle, man.
Yes.
Yeah. No, we'll definitely do that in time.
Yeah.
I believe even this session, I mean, I love that generally the ICNA Council for Social Justice programs are about just an hour or so. And I did not have the heart to stop any of you with these profound conversations that we were having. So we are into hour and a half, and I think we have recorded this, so it will be made available online for viewing. I would like to close with the following, a kind of a quick answer from all three of you. If you were to define Malcolm X with an adjective, what would that be?
well, I'll use his own words. He says sincere.
Sincere. Okay.
Yeah, that was my word. That's my word, Sister Aisha. Yeah, that's how he described himself.
Yeah.
Brother Bill, what would you say?
Path breaking.
So true. And I know that so many others we can also attribute him to. Hard for me to close, but Zahid, do you have any closing remarks before I close it?
I think that's wonderful. A lot of huge food for thought. And
Food for thought, yeah. I close with this eulogy that Ossie Davis gives, that's mentioned in the autobiography of Brother Malcolm. And I'll read just a portion of that, and then we close. So he says in his eulogy, he, referring to Malcolm X, kept shouting the painful truths we, the whites and the blacks, did not want to hear from all the housetops. And he would not stop for love nor money. You can imagine what a howling, shocking nuisance this man was to both Negroes and whites. Once Malcolm fastened on you, you could not escape. He was one of the most fascinating and charming men I have ever met, and never hesitated to take his attractiveness and beat you to death with it. Yet, his irritation, though painful to us, was most salutary. He would make you angry as hell, but he would also make you damn proud. It was impossible to remain defensive and apologetic about being a Negro in his presence. He would not let you. And you always left his presence with the sneaky suspicion that maybe, after all, you are a man. So, Jazakallah khair, may God's
James
mercy.
Baldwin. Was it Ozzy or James Baldwin?
Yeah.
Same Ossie Davis,
Yeah,
but
I thought that sounded very strange, for us, the eulogy, yeah. But-
yeah,
Yeah,
so
that wasn't in the eulogy though.
Yeah.
Mr. Davis wrote the following in response to a magazine editor's question: "Why did you eulogize Malcolm X?" And therefore, Ossie Davis writes
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
answer.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought you were saying that was part of the eulogy.
I did.
Yeah, no, it was an answer to a question.
I got you. I'm sorry.
No,
sorry
problem.
about that.
But yeah, so it's such a pleasure and honor to have this conversation with all of you. But we close with a prayer for our brother Malcolm X and his family for the sacrifices he made. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive his mistakes and shortcomings, grant him the best of heavens, and grant us and bless us with the courage and the conviction and passion to speak truth to power regardless of consequences, and stay true to our faith, and stand with the oppressed and the poor, and against all injustices, regardless of who does it and where. We ask that we, inshallah, too shall see him in the best of heavens, and may we all be blessed to continue the legacy of Brother Malcolm X in our lives, not in a ceremonial and ritual fashion, but in a real living way in our lives. With that, I thank each one of you for taking the time and giving us this evening hour to us. And Jazakumullah khairan. May Allah bless each one of you and your families. Keep safe and stay healthy. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.